Hello, and welcome to the Global Dialogue series for May, which is Mental Health Awareness Month. Today, we're going to be having a dynamic conversation about pathways for healing, having an in-depth conversation, looking at the relationship between abuse, domestic abuse, and sexual violence, and mental health. My name is Melissa Morbeck, and I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships at the No More Foundation, and it is my honor to be with you today. What we're going to talk about today may be a bit triggering for people. Please know that we are here to support you. You can always reach out to us, take a look at our global directory, and know that we're here for you. Please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box. We will be taking some time to chat with our panelists with your questions later in the program. So we're together for a whole hour today to have a really in-depth look at this issue. I'd like to start by introducing our fantastic panelists we have today. I'd like to start with Hannah Hollander, who is founder and executive director of Speak Your Truth, which is a Facebook support group for domestic violence victims and survivors with over 18,000 members across the globe. Hannah is an experienced graphic designer as well as a branding and social media strategist. And I find my conversations with her so enlightening because I learned so much about what survivors are saying now, not to label people, but that's critical for us to understand. Paul Fugelsang is founder and executive director of Open Path Psychotherapy Collective. Paul is a licensed professional counselor based in North Carolina. Paul provides services online and works with English and Spanish speakers. Paul received his master's degree in contemplative psychotherapy from Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado. Paul supports people suffering from anxiety, symptoms of depression, or those of us who have experienced trauma, which is so important when we have these conversations, to have that dynamic background. And we're thrilled to have Paul join us today. Becca Odom is founder of Becca Odom Wellness. Becca is a partner with Open Path and is a licensed clinical social worker, registered yoga teacher, and she has over a decade of experience in the field of mental health, specializing in combining somatic approaches with EMDR for trauma recovery. She provides expert training to therapists on trauma-informed care, self-care for social workers, and more. What's great about having Becca as part of this conversation is some of those real-life examples of what we can be doing for self-care. And finally, we have Sarah Stewart joining us. Sarah is author of The Monster in My Home, Surviving Evil. Sarah is a domestic abuse survivor, mom, attorney, author, and celebrated speaker. She opens our hearts and our minds to the real experience of a survivor. She lives in the United States, where she strives to change the narrative and culture surrounding domestic violence. So everyone, welcome to our conversation today. We, again, are thrilled to have you. I'd like to start with really, so what is the connection between domestic abuse and mental health? And I think I'll throw it out there to Paul. Nothing like being the very first question.
Yeah, it's quite a question. So I'm coming here as the executive director of Open Path, which is a nonprofit which helps connect people to affordable psychotherapy. And I'm also a clinician. And I want to say that I'm not an expert in any of the matters that we're talking about today. It occurs to me that as human beings, we're living in a significant amount of confusion. Unfortunately, it seems like cultural systems have continued to break down, and as confusion increases and as mentorship decreases, it seems that we have less and less and fewer opportunities for creating healthy systems. And as a result, violence continues to increase. I think we see over and over again that as anxiety increases in certain populations, violence follows quickly by. So it seems to me that when people are living in situations and cultures and communities that are routinely plagued by economic uncertainty, by trauma, by generational trauma, that it lends itself to a great deal of confusion, as I said, and behind that increased amounts of violence.
Paul, in your work that you have seen, people who have been traumatized, are there some presenting symptomologies that people who have experienced trauma may come with you? So that, I guess what I'm trying to do is get to, if someone is on this webinar listening to this, and they might be experiencing something, so that they don't feel that there's something wrong with them, which I think is often an issue that those of us who walk this path can feel, because we don't have insight to this. So things like maybe anxiety, depression, those sorts of things.
Well, fortunately, we have Becca Odom here, who knows quite a bit about the symptomology of a dysregulated nervous system. So I think rather than fumbling my way through that, I might pass it over to Becca.
That sounds fabulous. Becca, pick it up.
Absolutely. It can look different for different people, but there are certain systems that really get impaired when people go through significant traumas. And so it might be issues with digestion, it might be sleep challenges. We know traditionally, like flashbacks, hypervigilance, really like strong startle responses can be another symptom, negative self-perception or self-talk, isolation, which I think can be a really complex piece that can come from that too. Dissociation, so checking out often, like not sure where we were, kind of losing track of time or self, or feeling disconnected from our body in a moment of stress. And I know you mentioned anxiety and depression as well. It could be some of the things that you can see or start to track to get an indication of what somebody might be experiencing after they've been through trauma.
We're going to be taking some time and speaking about some of the ways in which we can self-care and address these issues, and talk about the great work at Open Path, which really has taken the lead in changing the conversation and how people can access support and what support looks like. But before I do that, Sarah, I'm wondering if you can share with us your experience and how support, mental health support, helped you.
So I am a survivor of domestic violence. I was married to my abuser for about 7 years, had a 10-year relationship with him. He was a police officer. So I found resources hard to come by because people had a hard time believing that he did the things he did. That's changed a lot more recently, but that's based on his actions and not necessarily just kind of the way that the system is. So I find that we have a good resource system where I live. There is a community resource facility where they have police officers housed with DHS, housed with legal service providers, housed with community service providers, but they're limited. And we have a lot more need than we do resources. So what we find is long waiting lists. They do provide things like therapy, they do provide support groups, but there's only so many people they can help at a time. And so that's where I think our issue really comes in, at least in the state that I live in, is that we just don't have enough funding and enough resources available for survivors.
Thank you, Sarah. I think that's very important for us to hear. Hannah, you have had a chance to chat with some of your people within your membership, and I'm very interested to hear what it is that you reached out to them with, and what are some of the findings from Speak Your Truth?
Yeah, so first, thank you so much for including us in this conversation. Really excited to talk about it because it's something that in our support group, I feel like we're kind of a gateway. We're like the first, oftentimes the first place that people are reaching out to, even before they seek therapy. So we're oftentimes recommending Open Path and recommending Psychology Today and resources for them, because we know how impactful therapy and other forms of healing can be in the healing journey of a survivor. And so we were able to ask our members a lot of questions about their journey to seeking support, and also how that support may have either helped or hindered them in the journey, what it was like for them, and how soon, when, at what point in their journey did they seek support. We actually found, which I thought was actually surprising, that there was a majority of people seeking support and seeking therapy before they even left the relationship. So I took that as members are or survivors are finding their way into therapy and therapist offices before even seeking resources for domestic violence, before they even know.
Wow.
It's so common for abusive relationships to seek couples therapy, even though we know that couples therapy doesn't work for abusive relationships. But anyways, I just found that, surprising. And then, the amount of survivors that said that their therapist was actually influential in helping them escape the relationship. That was really cool to see, because that's the goal, right? Is to have a therapist that knows the signs of abuse and can speak into that when they are entering their space. And so unfortunately, we did, of course, receive a lot of negative feedback. There was a lot of, like what we've mentioned, different barriers, that people, survivors specifically face in getting support, a lot of wait lists, a lot of insurance difficulties, or not being able to afford it. Just the state of being in denial is something that is universal, I think, for survivors for a time. And so that's all, what our members and survivors are facing and seeking support. There was also, cases of just really bad therapy interactions or interactions with therapists. They said hurtful things to them. They didn't understand abuse. They didn't understand what they were going through. They, especially in the couples, a lot of people opened up about couples therapy and how the therapist was focusing on their abusive partner's, needs and wants, and not recognizing the clear abuse that they were disclosing, and a lot of others. So I'm sure we're going to get more into, kind of those findings and kind of where the survivors are coming from. But that's a little bit, of what we were able to find, which was really cool, I think, and kind of starting this discussion and how, where the survivors are coming from and accessing quality support.
So we're having conversations now based on and you've just done this research. This was done in the last few days. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So this is sort of hot off the press. Well, let's talk about some of those issues. And I'd like to go to whoever would like to jump in on this. We talk about these barriers, the wait lists, the insurance, the affordability, sort of where are we in this process? Is it all up to the person who is experiencing to deal with this, or are there ways that society, that systems need to change and adapt to the urgent need that is out there? And Paul, you're smiling. I'm going to you. Okay.
I'm smiling because that was a bit of a leading question, Melissa.
Was it? Was
it? Yeah, I think you're exactly right. It's a huge systemic problem. What we're doing at Open Path, we feel really good about what we're doing at the end of the day, and we're also not kidding ourselves that it's a tiny little ripple we might be affecting in the midst of an ocean of difficulty and suffering. As we look at what's happening economically throughout our culture, and as the systems of power and as the wealth divide continues to increase, no one should be surprised that violence follows along after it. As I was saying earlier, it seems that our knee-jerk response has been to talk about self-care and self-care and self-care. And while there's a place for that, and while it's completely necessary and helpful on a certain level, when we're not talking about community care, we're not talking about systemic care, we're leaving a huge part of the conversation out. And this is very tragic on many levels.
Paul, can you tell us a little bit about what Open Path is and how people can reach out to your organization?
Sure. So I started Open Path 10 years ago, so we're the same age as No More. And I was working as a therapist in private practice, and I felt like it was my ethical responsibility to see a few clients at a low fee slot, a sliding scale slot. And then after those slots were filled, when people would call me asking for reduced fee therapy, and I had to tell them no, I also had to tell them I had no place to send them. And if they had to go to Psychology Today or wherever and just start picking up the phone and engaging in the rather dehumanizing experience of calling therapist after therapist asking for a lower fee. So I thought, well, it would make sense to not only figure out how to use the internet to get together a group of therapists who are offering lower fees, but then also to encourage those therapists to maybe slide a little lower than they normally might in their fee scale. So that's how Open Path was born. And fortunately, the idea is taken. We have about 22,000 therapists in our network around the country and Canada, and we've connected about 110,000 clients to affordable care since we started. So I feel very immensely grateful for its success and for all the therapists who are very, very generous in giving it themselves to make this project work.
I think one of the things that I'm hearing, and I'm asking this sort of from two different perspectives, one as my role within No More, but also as a survivor myself. Insurance companies, and I'm not trying to slate them per se, but I don't know how much help is actually given through the insurance model. And does the insurance model work for the issues of trauma that are faced by people who experience abuse? That's open to anyone.
I'll hop in really fast. Yeah, I'll hop in just because another thing that I found really interesting from people is when we were talking about how was it the process for you in seeking quality help. We found several members were talked a lot about how they only could afford the free services provided to them oftentimes by their local DV agency, or their insurance, what their insurance allowed, and insurance and those free resources oftentimes don't include EMDR or kind of higher forms of therapy that have been really proven to help trauma survivors. So I find that really interesting that insurance or whatever it might be, and I of course don't have a lot of knowledge in all of that area and how that works. I would refer to Paul and Becca there, but I find it interesting that they don't cover the really vital forms of therapy that people need, or even Reiki or alternative forms of healing are not covered by insurance oftentimes.
Becca, thank you, Hannah. Becca, you mentioned the different types of symptomology, I think. So I'd like to move to what are some of the unique challenges that survivors of domestic and sexual violence may face when seeking mental health services? And then I have a follow-up question.
Yeah, I think so. In the work that I do, I'm really focusing on the nervous system and that self-regulation piece. And I think a really difficult piece in that lens is because when we've gone through trauma, that executive functioning of kind of completing these tasks and having to follow these different trails to find the therapist, it's just difficult no matter what. But when our brain is in that state of that stress response, that kind of daily functioning is even harder. And so I just really want to name that piece, because I think if anyone's experiencing that, I want them to know they're not doing anything wrong. Like that's part of what happens to our brain when we go through trauma. And it can feel really difficult to organize, to problem solve, to, kind of manage those pieces. And so I want to name that piece because I think that can be really difficult. I think my mission in this work is really to try to take the shame out of trauma, to understand the brain and body response, and then have some tools to do something with it and to support it. And then like that kind of problem solving and task oriented, things that we need to do to find that support, I think can become a little more easeful when we have a little bit more of that support for the nervous system, for our brain to just function in that, because I think it can be really difficult.
What are some of the trauma support? What is the type of therapy? What are the type of techniques that we use to support a person who's dealing with trauma? And I'll turn that to anyone who would like to contribute, but I'll start with Becca.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So the model that I follow it's a stage model for trauma recovery. It was created by a woman named Judith Herman, and so she breaks trauma recovery into 3 stages. But the first stage is really about stabilization. It's about nervous system regulation before we go into the reprocessing piece of like reprocessing and telling our story. Like, let's have a foundation in the body. Let's have our lids on, a more regulated state. And so I think that piece is an important stepping stone, to start to kind of work with that element first before we even go into those modalities that would be reprocessing. And I think sometimes that can be a misstep. We can jump right into that reprocessing or start before we have that foundation in the body. And so I think that's just a piece that I wanted to reference in this chain of healing.
Well, what is EMDR?
Oh, you're asking me that question?
Yes, I wasn't sure if you practiced it. I just thought I'd
No, I don't practice it. No,
okay.
EMDR is a form of trauma therapy that I have done as a client and have never studied. It's very interesting.
Hannah or Becca, can you address what EMDR is? Because Hannah, you mentioned it.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Becca, because I forget the what it stands for. I know it's like eye motion something.
Yeah, so it's eye movement desensitization reprocessing. So essentially when our brain is in REM sleep, our eyes actually dart back and forth. It's how our brain organically kind of files events of the days and organizes things. And so EMDR takes that process and we target it at a specific memory, a traumatic memory. And it takes that emotional charge and files it into this factual part of the brain. Because of course, what we've been through will always be a fact, but the triggers, the flashbacks, the belief systems, EMDR really works on helping the brain kind of refile and organize that and shift where it's stored in the brain. It's amazing.
And what happens to a person's body when that shifts? So from a body perspective.
Yeah. Well, I kind of so I do the nervous system regulation before I do EMDR. So there's already a shift in the body. And then once we refile that, the kind of electric charge or triggers, they kind of decrease the intensity. And so the dysregulation that can happen then really shifts. So somebody might see or smell or hear something that reminds them of the trauma, and they might not have as much of a stress response, right? Or be able to kind of come back online a little sooner would be another way that the body would shift afterwards.
And we've spoken about having flashbacks. And in my generation, a bazillion years ago, it was called PTSD. And is that something that survivors are dealing with? And how is PTSD and complex PTSD different? Becca, I'm going to throw that to you.
Sure. Yeah. Great question. So my understanding, so PTSD versus complex PTSD. So PTSD traditionally is thought of as like an incident, like can be like a single incident or an event that happened, versus complex PTSD would be more of something that was more ongoing, like living for many years within that abuse system or cycle, or growing up in a household that had abuse or neglect. So it's more kind of an ongoing piece that brings in more complexity to it. But a lot of the symptoms that you would see can be pretty similar, depending on what the person's been through.
Mm-hmm.
I'd also add, Melissa, here that both of these things, in one way, can be characterized as a chronic inability to inhabit the body. That so often what we find with people who are suffering from PTSD and the effects of trauma is that the body becomes a seemingly very unsafe place to inhabit, and a disembodiment occurs where the person almost entirely resides in their mental thought processes. And we know from so many forms of health that health can be characterized as a synchronization of mind and body, and not as a split. And when this split occurs, there's really a tendency for these problems to exacerbate and build on each other and become exponentially worse. So I think so much of what happens in really effective trauma therapy is there's a coming home to the body and a learning that the body is not only safe, but also a really effective instrument for moving towards health.
I like what you're saying about the body being safe. Because when we think about people who have endured extensive periods of trauma, we're talking about heightened cortisol.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about hormones and stressors being really high that can then break down body functionality, lead to various illnesses before we even talk about anxiety, depression, PTSD. So I think that, and wild opinion here, but I think that we need to take a look at that mind, body, spirit connection from a holistic perspective. Sarah, you've been hearing some of we've been discussing, and how is all of this resonating with you and how you're feeling about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's important for survivors, not just adults, but children, to find some sort of help. When one of the resources I really enjoyed for my state was Know Your Self-Worth. And it's kind of a psychotherapy class that takes you through, why did this happen to me? And I'm a big why person, and I like to know why things happen. So what's going on in my brain, or what happened in my life that made me susceptible to some of the things that have taken place. So that was a great thing that I went through. I kind of had a similar experience to what Hannah mentioned with, I had sought therapy for myself privately prior to leaving the relationship. And really all I needed was someone to say, it's not going to change. And that's when I left. But not everyone has the resources financially to be able to do that. We know that many people who go through abusive relationships suffer financial abuse. And so they don't have the money to go out and do these things privately. you know, they may not have insurance. They may not have the money to have insurance. And so that's the biggest barrier I see for people is financial. And, you know, when it comes to child custody, sometimes these things can be thrown up in the court and used against the person who's actually seeking help, right? And so there's a lot of, as you've mentioned, holistic system reform that I think we need to look into. And I know that's, you know, a process, but I think it's a process that we need to work for and start fighting for our survivors.
Thank you, Sarah. We've had a question come in that I'd like to pose to everyone. Are there culturally sensitive programs that help women towards empowerment? And if so, does anyone know any of them? Anybody want to jump in on this one?
Locally, we have some. I don't know that they're national. I know that our YWCA does that. We also have Latinx specific programs here called La Luz. I'm not certain if that is national either, but you might look at your local community programs and they should be able to point you in the direction of culturally sensitive resources.
And I would think at Open Path that there are people who work within different cultures as well. Is that correct, Paul? Oh, you're on mute. Sorry.
I always do that at least once during every. On Open Path, we have a search page which has filters on there which you can filter out, looking for more culturally sensitive care. There's also, as Sarah mentioned, there's a Latinx therapist group which you can find by Googling. There's Therapy for Black Girls. You know about. There's the Loveland Foundation, which helps Black women get free or affordable psychotherapy. So there are options out there for therapeutic care.
Hannah or Becca, anything you want to add to this?
I just thank you for sharing those resources. I think that that's a plus side of at this phase of where we're at, you know, in the pandemic or post-pandemic, is so much became online. And so I'm seeing a lot more that's now available that never was a few years ago. And so I do think that that gives a lot of hope that there's a lot more access that's growing because we're on that wider platform now.
Do you think that online therapy and support is as effective as in person for people who are traumatized? Anyone can answer that.
I think it depends. Yeah, I think I have some clients who being in their home with their dog and they're cozy, all the things, and they don't have to fight traffic and a lot of dysregulation to get to me, I think works really well for folks. And then there's some people who really want that space to go into. And so I think it really depends on the person. But I like that there's options now where before that wasn't even an option. And I think some folks have been surprised how much they really enjoyed the virtual aspect to have that option.
Yeah, I think, I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to jump in because we actually asked this question to our members was, you know, do you, if you have been in therapy, you know, are you doing in-person or online sessions? What do you prefer and why? And majority of people actually did say they preferred virtual. Of course, there was a handful that said they needed it in person. They were very much in person. They need that to feel connected. But again, all of the same reasons that you said, it you know, was less anxiety, you know, it worked with their schedule. A handful of people said that they actually preferred phone calling over and having sessions over the phone, just because it worked better for them. And so I love actually, you know, everything that's happened with COVID has been, you know, such a journey for all of us, but it has improved, I think, dramatically with the access of mental health services virtually.
Paul, please.
Oh, I was going to add that I think by and large across the board, therapists have been very pleasantly surprised at how effective online works. I think there are many of us who would have been quick to say, well, maybe it's about 50% as effective, and that's better than nothing. But I think that since the pandemic began, so many of us have really come around to being very pleasantly surprised.
That's wonderful news to hear that from both a person who would seek it as well as from a therapist perspective. I know that Hannah has to leave us in a few minutes, so I'm going to ask her the same question I'm going to ask all of you later. What would you like to say to people who are attending this call, who are listening to us today, who might be considering what we've been speaking about, or some of their own questions they'd like to ask? What would you say to them?
Yeah. Well, we ask this to our members too. What I love about our mission at Speak Your Truth is really to amplify survivor voices. And so I did poll and request, if it was okay if I could mention some of these quotes that our members have actually told, what advice would you give survivors who are seeking support? And, they said, there's no shame in seeking guidance to heal and protect our minds and hearts. There's no harm in trying. Getting help is a form of self-love, helps you out of the flight or fight mode. Give yourself grace through the process. I think there's such a collective story and journey that all survivors are on, and we are here for you. We're a great first step. If this conversation is making you think about therapy, if you've never gone or want to try a different form of therapy or a new therapist, or just get support in any sense, we're a great place to start. You can find us on Facebook, Speak Your Truth, and answer a couple questions to get accepted into our private group. And yeah, we're here to support, really.
Thank you, Hannah, very much. We really appreciate it. I'm getting many questions that are coming in, but before I do that, we've mentioned a lot of different resources, and I'd like to share with the audience that we are going to be posting those resources. We're going to be sharing this. This, as you know, is being recorded, and we're going to have some follow-up posts and emails about the different resources that folks have been talking about today. I guess I'd also like to say that mental health issues can be very painful for the person who is walking them. And if a person is in a state of real upset, what's the first thing that they should do? I'm opening this up to the floor. Why don't we start, Sarah? Why don't we start with you?
It's kind of hard for me sometimes to think back to those days when I was still in that cloud, because that's kind of what it is as you're coming out of it. In my experience, it's a cloud. What worked for me, and I know it's different for everybody, was journaling, because I could start to process what was real versus what these memories were that this person wanted me to have, right? Because there's a lot of gaslighting and manipulation that I experienced. So journaling helped me kind of get a grip on what reality was. And then from that point, I could start to focus on healing and focus on therapy and focus on support groups. And I'm also a researcher, so I looked up everything I could imagine. Any question I had, I Googled in Psychology Today. So for me, information is power. I know that's not the case for everyone, but for me, just realizing that I wasn't alone, that these were experiences other people had. When I first came out, there was a little bit of embarrassment and shame of how could I have allowed myself to deal with that, right? Not understanding, not recognizing. Of course, as you heal, you realize that's not your fault. But that's what I want to say to people is that's not your fault. You are not alone. And there's a bunch of different ways that you can start to really heal and understand and process your experiences.
Thank you, Sarah. Becca, how would you answer that?
For me, yoga was the first step. It was something I already had. And I remember at a point in my own journey of feeling like everything feels different, but child's pose is the same, right? Like everything feels like it's like upside down, but like this shape of my body or the feeling of just laying on my mat, like that felt like my home base. And so I think that was a first step for me, was just trying to find a way to feel at home within the body, or something that was familiar with the body. So it might be going to a place that was really familiar, or getting on the mat and just being in a pose that feels really nourishing. So to me, that was a helpful first start.
Paul, what would you say to someone who's really struggling at the moment?
Well, I so appreciate what Sarah said about being in the fog and realizing that Sarah, you were in a fog, and then beginning the process of exiting it, because I think the really tricky nature of being in a fog is so often we don't know we're in it until we're in some real trouble. And so it's such a huge first moment when we wake up and go, oh gosh, I'm lost in something right now and I need help. And I was so happy to hear what Hannah had to say about asking for help. It's such a crucial necessity to being a human being, and it's something that we're not really encouraged to learn about much, especially in this culture. I've in my own work, I've been looking at my own internal resources and this whole cast of characters that I have living in my internal world, and how I so infrequently turn to them and ask for help, but they're always there waiting. So I think there's a process of asking for internal help, and then also external help in whatever form that may be. And I think so often it could be just calling a friend and saying, hey, I need to tell you something, or you know, a trusted friend, of course, or just having any sort of bedrock community that we can lean on for a little bit, whether it be a faith community, a bowling league, or anything, a place that we can go and where we can sit around other people and be quiet and feel held. I think all those things really help us begin the process of emerging from that fog. And then I just want to echo what Becca said about yoga. I think any sort of practice that allows us to get back into our bodies and encourages that energy to start moving, I think that's all extremely helpful for moving out of that fog.
Hannah, before you sign off, is there anything that you'd like to share?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to share some advice that my mom gave me when, you know, all of us need that motherly care, especially after leaving an abusive relationship. And something, you know, that was like her mantra to me. I was always calling her up crying, you know, in the months of leaving. And it was like, have you eaten today? Have you drinking water? You know, let's start there. And if you know, if this is where you're at, you know, go drink a glass of water, go have a nice meal. Like, let's start there, and I'm sure your body will thank you, and you'll be able to start thinking more clearly and getting the help that you need. So with that, I think I will head out, but thank you so much. It was so great to be a part of this conversation.
Thanks, Hannah, and thank you for your time. For me, and I just want to share with people, when I left my abusive husband, it was a very dramatic situation, and I did not know what was going on. It was that fog, and I was in a shelter for a while and then moved elsewhere. And when I felt safer, suddenly the room would spin and things would be upsetting. And I remember that there was somebody in the town I lived in. I lived in a little tiny town, and he had talked about the Veterans Administration. And I walked over and knocked on his door and I said, I don't know what's wrong with me. Can you help me? And I just broke down because it was so confusing. It was so hard. I didn't get it. I was like, I thought I left, and this all started about 6 months after I left. So I think sometimes we get to a point where when we're safe, and you're talking about getting to know your body. So I know that when I'm feeling panicky, I put my feet on the floor. I go walk in the grass in my garden. I look at nature. I do those sorts of things, and I just try to calm my heart down. We've had some questions, and again, I'm going to come out with these. And this one is: a current legislative priority here in Rhode Island is tackling the issue of abusive litigation. Do any of you live or work in states where this policy change has happened? And if so, have you seen a positive impact on the well-being and healing of survivors? I don't know if anyone has any experience with any of this. Paul, I'm sensing no. Becca, no.
I'm actually an attorney, so I have a little bit of experience with it.
Sure.
But I do live in the South, and we don't have a lot of progressive, unfortunately, legislation. What I have noticed, however, we don't have any legislation helping with that, but we have found interesting ways to use current law to rally against people who use litigation to abuse other people. So you may be able to find a group of attorneys in your state that can help you point out how abusive people also use litigation against others, how financially burdensome that is, how time burdensome that is. So I'm not familiar with the actual legislation you're referring to, but I am familiar with ways that it is being used, kind of just the idea, the concept itself in litigation to help people who have to deal with that experience, unfortunately.
Thank you, Sarah. And this is something where we can look into this and we can be posting some information on this. To Paul, we've had a question. Can you mention how this is the person asking the question, could go forward to starting such an organization like yours in my state? And the question is, gosh, where do I begin? So open path, and how do we, what do we do?
Well, it's the landscape of the internet has changed so much in the last 10 years since I started Open Path that it feels like I started it in the 1980s by comparison. It's become so much more tangled and there's so much more noise. I don't think I'd have well, I didn't really have a clue what I was doing back then either, but I'd have far less of a clue now. I think in regards to this question, it might be helpful to start by figuring out if the therapist in this person's community are interested in something like this. What I did when I started Open Path, or when I was kicking the idea around, I took a lot of people out to lunch, and I ran the idea by them, and I asked for their honest feedback. And by and large, people told me, yeah, I think I would join that. I think I would do something like that. That sounds good to me. And that sort of gave me the courage and the push I needed to keep going and keep the momentum going. So I think maybe as a starter, I'd recommend that if this person could start surveying people and therapists or clinicians in their community to learn about what the needs are and what they might be into supporting.
To add on that, I even wonder, because there's Facebook groups for therapists too. And so I even wonder, like, doing a poll on like those Facebook groups to reach more people in their state. That could be a helpful way to kind of widen that net too. I love that idea.
Becky, you had mentioned before we joined our call today that you had some resources that you wanted to share with people and to talk about some of the work that you offer as a form of healing within Becca Odom Wellness. Can you elaborate a bit on that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have two branches of the work that I do. So outside of my private practice, I have a lot of free resources on my website. I think it was shared in the chat. So I have some different YouTube videos that have exercises that are trauma informed and somatic. So working with the body with breath or self-massage or gentle movement. I know sleep can be really challenging for a lot of folks because when we're in that state of stress, it's really hard to go into that deeper state of sleep. So I have a free ebook on there to support somebody kind of going through that process of changing their sleep patterns and supporting that stress management. And then I teach trainings for therapists to try to help bring more trauma-informed clinicians into the world, because I think that's also a really big need that we're seeing, is to make sure that folks have these tools and also have that trauma-informed lens, because we're working with it every day. So those are kind of the main ways to gather more information or resources.
And if I can give a Becca Odom commercial, Becca and I don't know one another very well, but we did live in the same town at one point, and She recently gave a webinar to therapists about developing healthy sleep habits and helping their clients develop them. And it was so widely praised by so many in attendance. She did such an excellent job. So I'm sure your website is filled with really great resources.
Thank you.
And I think that's something for all of us to think about. Having joined this call today, we have to make sure that we're drinking our water, to Hannah's mom's point, having a little food that's not sugar-based, and also getting some good, healthy sleep. We've had a question, and it's not really to do with mental health, and I hope it's not wiped out here. I've been reading lately about legislation to ban no-fault divorce. The person lives in Florida, in parentheses, sadly, that would adversely impact women needing to leave abusive marriages. Any thoughts? Does anyone want to just give a comment on that?
I don't know if you heard my sigh just now.
I did. And I was going to point to you, but Paul, go ahead.
Well, I think my sigh says it all. I'm so disheartened by all of this legislation that's continuing to unfold. That's systematically alienating people more and more, and disempowering people more and more. It feels like another very unfortunate symptom of this malaise that our culture is going through right now. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. That's great.
Yeah, I think this has
Go ahead, Becca, please.
I think how that can compound the impact of trauma can be so significant. So I just really want to recognize how oppressive and challenging that can be to create that healing when we have that external forces also tightening in on our ability to heal, to leave.
Yeah, I think no-fault divorce in a domestic abuse situation is hard enough. So having to prove a reason, it's like shackling someone to a marriage, and who wants their marriage to be a prison? So I really don't see any benefits. It's going to clog up the court system even more than it already is, but it's disappointing that these types of legislation are coming out. And so I don't think it's a good thing personally.
Thank you. And I'm glad to have, we went a little off beam, but it's good for us to have really address some of these questions that our audience are putting through to us. I know that in the therapeutic practice, and there can be many different types, we meet our therapist, we have some chit chat. Often the big issue for people who endure abuse is trust. So maybe we start trusting the person. What does a person do if they just feel like this isn't working?
You mean the therapeutic relationship?
Yes. Paul, would you like to address that?
Sure. I think so often finding the right therapist is akin to dating, and sometimes it doesn't work out right away, and you have to go on a few different dates. And I think sometimes we can meet a therapist and feel like it's the right relationship, but there's a nagging voice saying, is this really the right relationship? Is this real? I've had therapists before who I became a little bit enchanted by because of their charisma or their knowledge, and I thought, well, I have to continue working with this person because I feel this sense of enchantment. And then all along there was a voice going, wait a minute, I don't know. And I think that if that voice is persistent enough, that it probably has some wisdom embedded in it, and it's probably worthwhile listening to. And therapists get fired all the time. It's part of the job, and it's part of the therapist's responsibility to make space for that. So it's my hope that that people will, if they hear that voice, and if they intuitively feel like this is not the right relationship, that they can turn towards that and make change.
Absolutely. And I like to always talk to my clients about practicing, that this gets to be the petri dish of assertive communication and advocating for our needs. And I think it's an edge, but what safer place to explore that edge of saying this isn't working for me than with a trained, licensed mental health professional. So I think it can be a really great place to practice that communication of saying, this isn't working, I need something different.
I'd like to read out a comment that we've received. As a therapist and DV expert advocate, I'd like to emphasize safety first, often before therapy. I put the often in there. A victim survivor can't begin to heal if he or she, I'm added the he, is still in an abusive relationship. I think to Hannah's point, sometimes we need to explore what that relationship is too. So I think that's really important. So I'm going to ask the three of you the question I asked Hannah. What is it that you'd like to say today to our listeners, to someone who might be considering mental health support, addressing challenges, or perhaps needing a little bit of encouragement? What would you like to say to them today? Paul, I'll start with you.
Okay. And I do have to leave at noon, so if we go over, I'm going to quietly say goodbye and peel off. But thank you so much for this opportunity to come and to be with y'all. This has been very enriching for me, and I'm most grateful. You know, as therapists are trained not to give too much advice, so I'm coming up blank right now. I hope that people will consistently continue to orient towards their inherent value, and that value will help them orient towards something that's more helpful in their lives.
Thank you, Paul. Becca.
I think the reminder that it's never too late to heal, right? That like it's always, we have this opportunity. I feel like healing is a spiral, and we kind of keep changing our perspective on what we're healing. And I keep feeling really called to say, in addition to coming into the body, like whether that's just feeling our breathing or noticing our senses or massaging our shoulders, just kind of coming back to sensation in the body can be a helpful place to start. And I know we talked about connection and reaching out to people, and isolation is a really common thing that happens with trauma. And so one thing sometimes people can do is even just going to like a park or a place where there's other people, and you might not want to interact with anybody, but finding a place to be around life and connection with community, I think can also be a place to just begin to feel and start to come back into ourselves. So those are a couple pieces I would add.
Thank you, Becca. And Sarah, finally, we'd love to hear from you.
I think the most important thing I want to say is just, it's not your fault. We're given often in abusive situations the script of how everything's our fault. So it's not your fault. And there are people who are there for you and who understand you and believe you. And finding that community can really help move forward your healing process. So looking at resources and reaching out and understanding that you're not to blame, I think, are the most important things.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to take time to thank all of our panelists today and to our audience, all of you here attending to be part of this dynamic, interesting conversation. I think it will be the start of many. I don't think it is necessarily an end conversation. I think with mental health and with abuse, there are always new avenues. There are always new ways of finding healing and support. I love what Becca said about it being, I'm thinking about fossils, and I don't forget what it is, but like the Fibonacci code, and it always goes that spiral, and it's that opening up, and it's that journey where I am now 30 years later is very different from that fog that I was in, but I know that there are times when something can happen, and I just need that support, and reaching out and trying to get support is critical, but we have to have the systems in place that support us. And so we must challenge those to do better. So I thank you on behalf of all of our guests and on behalf of the No More Foundation, and we look forward to having you join us again in the future. You will be hearing from us, and watch this space on some of the resources that we've heard about today. So thank you again for your kind contributions.